Definitely teach all levels of learners. I don't know what schools you guys are coming from, but I'm sure you have all different levels of learners. So I have found that this process works extremely well with strong learners, but you definitely see gains in learning and work production in deep levels of thinking about literature, even with the students who are not at an AP level. When I was doing some brainstorming over the past couple days before I knew you guys were going to be coming in, I started thinking about what close reading means to me, and I thought Jenny gave a pretty good definition, and I'm going to give you a lot of paper, but if you don't have your own paper, I have just some plain white paper if you want to take notes down, but I thought her definition was a pretty strong working definition. I kind of have a different definition for close reading, and that is deconstructing text, in this case literary text, with the intention of finding and making meaning. And meaning is a word that our department is using a lot, and I kind of define that when I talk about what I feel like close reading involves. But when I think of meaning and analysis, I'm thinking of getting kids beyond plot and characterization. Because I find that students, even students that aren't really strong in an English or language arts classroom, are really strong at plot and characterization. Maybe it's because they watch a lot of movies. Maybe because the video games that they play lead them in certain directions with plot structure and arc and all of those things. I find that they are all really proficient and comfortable about talking about those things. But when you get into deeper conversations about the literature, that's where a lot of them begin to shut down. So I'm hoping that the students are deconstructing the text with the intention of finding and making meaning. Well, what does that involve? Well, when I was thinking about it, I was thinking you definitely need to have a knowledge of literary devices. I'm hopefully going to take Johnny to the next step and say why it's worth his time to be able to identify where that's taking place. So you need to have a strong knowledge of literary devices, also a strong knowledge of universal ideas. I'm going to give you a handout on what I kind of feel universal ideas are, but you have to be able to, in order to get to deeper meaning, in order to get to a close reading, you have to have a strong sense of those two things. You have to be able to critically think, and that is what I find a lot of students are coming to me not being able to do in an English classroom. Right? They are able to identify. I guess it's that taxonomy, right? They just can't get into those upper levels of thinking about literature. So you have to be able to have critical thinking skills, and so we're building a lot of those at the beginning of the year. And then finally, you have to have the motivation to analyze beyond the basic character and plot. And that's something I don't know exactly how to teach. That's kind of it's the way you make kids think that English and literature is important, right? And I think every teacher has their own way they go about that. That becomes a very personal motivation for every English and language arts teacher. These are the benefits that I have found result from close reading and building close reading skills. Students are able to conceptualize text with clarity. I think so often we ask students to read a passage or read a poem. Now let's discuss it. And kids just feel so off balance because they just don't know where you want them to go. And where you want them to go is in a really clear direction with a through line of thought that is compelling, is interesting, is thoughtful. But I just find that a lot of students I come in contact with just aren't sure exactly how to do that, right? So this strategy will lead them in the direction of conceptualizing text with clarity. And once they're able to come to that clear conception, I find, and these are the byproducts of working on close reading all the time, I find that when you want to have class discussions, these discussions now have intention coming from the students, that the students feel like they can contribute in positive ways. And most importantly for me, is I feel like the writing starts to take on purpose and focus. Let me give you 4 tools that I give to every one of my students. I call them tools. They're pieces of paper that all help guide their interaction in the room, help guide their participation in discussion, and eventually writing and annotation and all of that. Okay, first piece of paper I'm going to hand out is just my literary term sheet. I'm sure lots of people have lit term sheets. When I asked Jenny if I should hand this out or not, she said, don't assume anything, so I'm going to give this to you. Now, a lot of these definitions I've taken from other places, but what I did was I composed only the lit devices that I felt like we were going to address in my room. Next, I talk a lot about tone. Tone is one of the literary devices, but I find that tone is a really accessible way for students to deal with the literature once they understand it. So when I ask kids, well, how do you think the speaker is feeling in this moment? I'm looking to get away from good, bad, happy, and sad, right? But that's where so many of our students go, and when I tell them, no, I need something else, they look at me like, well, what else do you want me to give you because I don't have it? They do, but they need this sheet, I find. So this sheet is coming out at the beginning of every single period, especially when we're doing a close reading, right? This is a tone sheet. It's just tone words that they can see that will help them to guide their own reading. It just kind of lets them, they're having these thoughts. But so many of our students are having the thoughts but are just not in the practice of then being able to send that out and prove to someone that they are, right? So I love this tone word sheet. This is like the number one thing I would have you look at and maybe examine and see if it would be worthwhile in your room. Next, we read a poem. Now I say, why did the poet write this poem? What's the purpose? Why are we reading this in class? I'm eventually trying to get them to universal idea and theme. The kids don't know exactly how to do that when they come to me. Maybe you all have a different experience. So I give them what I call a 100 universal ideas sheet. 100 universal ideas. And these are things, I call it AKA you can't touch this. I'm sure you all can tell that I'm fairly young myself, so it blows my mind when they don't understand the allusion to MC Hammer. And you can't touch this, especially when they all listen to rap music. But I guess they all read without reading Shakespeare too. Not that I'm equating MC Hammer to Shakespeare, I'm just saying. Okay. So this I want them to pull out at the end, right? Now that we've talked a lot about this poem, what universal ideas are you seeing explored in this particular poem or in this particular chapter of a long novel, right? So then they're like, and I say, remember, pull this out. Look. And I have them go through every time. I say, before you answer, let's take 120 seconds. Go through. Look at each one of these. See which ones you are noticing are jumping off the page to you today because they're jumping off the page to you with the poem that we're reading. Right? Finally, when we do want to talk about character, which often we do because the speakers in our poems, the pro and antagonists in our prose, are very interesting characters. And they want to talk about how interesting they are, but boy, they just don't have the, I guess, quick recall. That's what I would call it. They don't have the quick recall vocabulary skills to do it, but they can do it when you put them in front. Now, as a teacher, I'm hoping that eventually these sheets go away. But for now, this is just going to have to do. You see that? Okay, so these are the 4 things I give. I stagger these out. I do not give them all 4 of these things on the 3rd day of school. Right? What I do is I become really intentional with the poems, because we do poetry at the beginning of the year. I become really intentional with the poems that I'm giving and what I want them to take away from these first poems. So, man, if I find a poem that has a major tone shift in it, that's what I'm going to show them at the beginning of the year, because tone's one of the first things I'm going to hand them. Right? Also, we don't ever really do a test on this lit terms sheet. Right? Because I'm only giving them 1 or 2 at a time. Hopefully by December, we've gotten through half of these. Hopefully, if I've had a good year, we're through 3/4 and they can really discuss them with intention by the end of the year. But I'm never going to test them over this because it drove me nuts when I had to define some of these things and I didn't understand them, but I understood other literary elements better than anyone else in the room that never got tested or asked. So I kind of give this to them and then say, what are you comfortable with? What could you explore? So if you want to make a note on your 100 universal idea sheet, this is how I teach theme, because universal idea and theme is very, very closely connected. I explain to the kids, greed is not a theme. Greed is a universal idea. In order to come to a theme in my room, we follow the formula X as Y. And as is the important word there. X as Y. And then X is the universal idea. What do I mean by that? Well, I mean this. I've never read a Nicholas Sparks novel, but I know lots of girls in my class have, right? So I say, who's read a Nicholas Sparks novel? Someone raises their hand. I say, did he investigate love, the universal idea of love in this novel? And she's like, oh, yeah. And I'm like, whoa, I don't want too many details. Come on. It's only 8 o'clock in the morning. I'm not ready for my blood to be boiling like that. Okay. Love as what? What was he saying love is? Love as, takes them a minute, because they're looking to say the right answer. Then finally someone's brave enough to say, sweet? I say, yes. Sweet and cute and cuddly and nice and warm. Right? And so then I say, is that what love is? And everyone shakes their head, yes. And I say, well, let's look at a text like Romeo and Juliet. And let's look at love. The universal idea is definitely explored. But love as what in Romeo and Juliet? And if I've got kids that have read it, they start to say love as what? As tragic. Love as dangerous. Love as impulsive. See that? Love as desperation. Okay? Now, in my room, now you're getting a theme. Right? In his play, Romeo and Juliet, William Shakespeare examines the theme of love as impulsive through the use of certain literary devices. Characterization, and on and on and on. You see? Okay, so that's where I go with themes. So universal ideas and themes are very closely connected, but I had to figure out a way to get kids away from the canned morals of the stories. This is how I found to do it. Kids seem to gravitate towards it. And then that formula X is Y, your math kids that think that English just has a secret handshake that they don't know, once you start to put it into a formula for them, they really start to buy in. I just always make sure the kids have these out. Discussion gets so much better because at the beginning of the year I have to say, well, if you can't think of a tone, go to your tone sheet. But by November, December, they're already doing it. By February, March, they don't need it anymore. I think that's cool. I'd like to do a poem together. Can we do it? Okay. This is one of my favorite poems. And I don't find many people that know this poem. This is not a famous poem. This is not a poem of great literary merit. This is not what I call a thee-thou poem. This is just a poem, 20th century poem. So, I'm going to give you a copy of it. Then, when you leave, I'm going to give you another clean copy of it. So write all over this sheet. Whenever I give a poem, I put the exact same poem on the opposite side. So that way, at the end, there's going to be crazy amounts of writing all over this. Then I always like to take pride in what we're doing in the room. So at the end of the period, I'll say, can you believe that we got this from this? When they turn it over and they see the blank side, it's like, look at all the work we've done. Right? And then if an administrator comes in and says, what are you doing in here today? Because close reading sometimes can be hard to explain to an administrator. I say, well, we started here, and then we got to here. This is a poem by George Bogan named Cottontail. If you wouldn't mind, okay, now I'm gonna shift a little bit, and I'm kind of going to act like you're the students in the room. And then after the lesson, we'll debrief, and I'll just be interested in what you guys think. Okay? So what I would tell them to do is read this poem, then read it again, then we'll read it out loud. So just take a moment. Not much to it. Pretty straightforward. Sometimes English teachers would just take 15 minutes with it, then move on to the next poem or move on to whatever strategy they're going to tackle next. Spend about 2 class periods with this poem. Okay? It's to develop close reading skills. This is about the first one we do at the beginning of the year. Okay. First thing I always do. Now, I'm going to transition to here now because I model everything. Because if I don't model it, they ain't doing it, right? Okay, but then when they see me doing it, they're like, oh, I want to be smart and chubby like him one day, and so I have to do what he's doing, okay? So, first thing I have them do is that I have them ask about any words or PC references, pop culture references, that confuse them. If I give them a poem with a lot of words that I think are going to confuse them, or a lot of allusions or pop culture references, we're going to take 10 minutes to get the dictionaries out. I allow them a lot of times to use their phones, pull out their phones for a minute and look up a concept they don't understand. Any words in here that you're not familiar with? Usually there's one. But yeah, supplicating was the one the first time I looked at this poem, I had no idea. Supplicating is like begging, right? Or praying. You can almost connect it to praying. I usually tell kids, first annotation you can make is some reference to the word you don't know in the definition. The way I do that is I put, like along the same line, I put a V in a circle for vocab, and I just put begging. Right? I'm going to take 2 days on this. I'm probably giving it to them. Now, if there's a poem that has a lot of references to other things, maybe in my lesson plan, there are 20 minutes for them to look up. And maybe I will, I forget what it's called, but chunk that out. You take the first 10 lines and look up those words. You take the second 10 lines. You take the third 10 lines. Share out so we can get it done and move on. Right? Okay. Once I've done that, I do what's called, another rap reference, I do what's called a speaker box. And if you take anything besides the tone words away today, this would be next on the list. I am extremely standardized and formulaic in the way I approach this speaker box, especially with poetry. But I also do it at the beginning of novels and plays too. I create a box at the bottom of the page. There are some things that right off the bat I want to make sure we're all on the same page about. Okay? The reason I call it a speaker box is because we've created a box, and the first thing in the box is speaker. I put a speaker, and I put a colon. If you, I didn't plan on doing this, but I kind of keep all my modeled examples. If you look, all of my poems have speaker boxes at the bottom, you see? Okay? It's just the way we always do it, just to make sure we're all on the same page. Before we get to universal idea and theme and changing the world, we got to make sure everyone knows what's going on in the poem. Who would you all say the speaker of this poem is? Okay? Say again? One of the two little boys. Good. Now, first thing I challenge students on always is, are you sure it's a boy? When you go into the text this time, there is nothing to suggest. Some kids will say, yeah, because it says him right here. Him is referring to the rabbit. Now, I tell the kids, I always assume it's two boys too, right? In fact, if we're all on the same page and we want to go from there, we can. But is this a boy talking? What is this? How do you know? He's talking about 50 years later. So what I say is, the speaker, you can get as general or specific as you want. I say, because we will go with a male, a man 50 years removed from a life-changing event. Now, I would not have spoon-fed it to all the students like that. I would have said, what else can we say about this guy? But for the purpose of time, this is where I want them to get to. Okay? That's speaker. Next, I go audience. Audience in poetry is not that important unless the audience is a direct person. Like roses are red, violets are blue. I'm really excited and I love you. The you becomes very important. We know that the writer is writing directly to someone. What I tell the students, the nomenclature we use is, if this is a story that we are hearing for the first time, we've never heard it before, well, we are uninformed and we are readers. So the uninformed reader. I'm sure there's a much more academic way to say that, but the students seem to latch on to that. Didn't know this story before I sat down today. Now I know it. I was the uninformed reader. Okay? Speaker, audience, then I go setting. Okay? We've got farmer's field, which is a place. Good. What else? 50 years ago, which is a time. 50 years ago. Good. Anything else? Two little kids, but that's not our setting. Setting, time, and place. So what the other thing that I noticed, there's that angle of two stone fences, right? That's a place that's talked about. So I'll just say angle of the fence. Speaker, audience, setting. Sometimes I'll do topic because what I'm building for there is eventual thesis statement. But when I talk about topic, I talk about what is happening on the surface of the poem. Surface of this poem is, okay, you're getting your shovel out. That's what I tell the kids. Stay on the surface, don't go with your shovel. Two boys hunting. Now, why is topic important? Because some of the kids upon a first, a second, a third read don't know what the topic is. When I was in high school, especially the beginning of high school, they would say, we're going to do a poem today. And for some reason, I got so nervous because poetry was so hard. And I'd read it, and I was like, I just have no idea what's going on. Lots of students are like that. Okay. Attitude. Just because I'm interested, do you all talk about attitude and tone in your classes? How do you all differentiate the two? I had no idea how to do it. The AP training I took gave me a really good way to do it. For attitude, there are only two answers you can give in my room. Either positive or negative. That's it. Is the attitude of this speaker positive or negative? Negative, right? So in this case, our attitude is negative. That is a step to the next, which is tone. I hear pages flipping. My definition for tone is the intensity that proves the attitude. Well, how the heck do you know it's negative? Right? What tone is being used? That's where you use your R word, which is remorseful. There is a remorseful tone. Other words you may see. Or that you as an English teacher might just already know without looking at the sheet. A shameful tone. Say again? Bitter? Ooh, that's very interesting. A bitter tone. Good. That's right. Kids would say, this is a boring tone. I would say, what do you mean boring? They would say, oh, I just think the poem's boring. Is that what they would say? You'd say, oh, okay, well. He sounds bored when he's telling you. Oh, okay. That's like a neutral tone. And this is how I counteract that. If someone was bored about what they're telling us, why would they take the time to tell us? Right? Some kids will say, I think this is kind of a neutral tone. I don't think they feel one way or the other. I don't think the author feels one way or another about this. Then why on earth did this very smart person take the time to write this? That usually, with my kids, works. If you have extremely persistent kids, then I would probably say something along the lines of, well, hold that thought. Let me help you through this poem, and then let me know at the end if you still think that the poem is, or that the tone is boring. Okay. Now, once the year gets going, I add some things to the speaker box, but this is a good start. I feel like once we've had that conversation, that could take 20 minutes, we're all on the same page. Well, now let's get into the text. And usually I just say, what are you noticing about the text? And I try and train them to go chronologically. And when they are silent, I say, well, are you noticing any literary devices at the beginning of the poem? So I will ask you, are you noticing any literary devices at the beginning of the poem? Not really, right?
What imagery?
Okay, imagery. Where do you see the imagery? I'll never... There's a place that I definitely want to start, but boy, if a kid is brave enough to throw something out, I say, oh, okay, where? Where do you see this imagery? So we have an overall image at the beginning, right? Now, once we write that, I box whatever the literary device is. Overall image. We're getting an overall image at the beginning. Let me read you the beginning of the poem. I'm going to read it probably 3 times, and you tell me if you notice any other literary devices. A couple of kids, we went hunting for woodchucks 50 years ago in a farmer's field. Let me say that again. A couple of kids, we went hunting for woodchucks 50 years ago in a farmer's field. One more time. A couple of kids, we went hunting for woodchucks 50 years ago in a farmer's field. Sometimes it takes hearing it, right? But we see alliteration. What alliteration, examples of alliteration do we see? Okay, we've got F, F, F. I'm boxing those up. Anything else? Couple of kids. K. Right? Whoa, whoa, whoa. We went woodchucks. Right? So, now, I'm drawing lines out. I don't care that this gets dirty. I'm putting K, W, and F. We've got alliteration. Right? Like that. Very good. Now, is alliteration an example of a literary device? It is. So I'm going to box it up. Now, here's where the close reading comes in. Here's the difference between what I've seen before and what we do in my room. Why is that alliteration being used? Employed, in fact. Why? Okay, maybe it's the flow. Good. What else? Okay. Ooh, good. That almost gets you to like Beowulf, like Old English, where alliteration was so important, so Scops could remember the story. But what does this sound like to you? A couple of kids. We went woodchucks. 50 farmers field. Or as I do it to the students, and they laugh and giggle. Ka-ka-ka-ka. Wah-wah-wah-wah. Fa-fa-fa-fa. Or ka-ka-ka-ka. Wah-wah-wah-wah. Fa-fa-fa-fa-fa-fa-fa-fa. How does that sound? Say again? Kids talk. This alliteration helps us to understand what? In terms of kids. Just the childlike nature at the beginning, right? Couple of kids. Can't you just see them skipping around now? Okay. So alliteration, childlike. I'm going to go as far as to put the word tone. You have a childlike tone. Right? And I do that all year long. And now what's great is when you do your next poem and it's really dark and you have alliteration, I say, is this They're like, no, this is like ga. And they get into it. But this is less bibbity bobbity boo and more buh. Now, is that silly? Yes. Do poets use silliness? Yes. So we have a childlike tone that is established. Well, what do we know about good poetry and tone? what is it going to do? It is going to shift. This is the second poem I give them of the year. The first one I give them in my AP Literature and Composition class. They've been waiting for this for years. It's a poem called Nana's Little Angel. It's a really bad poem that just talks about how much the speaker just loves their Nana so much. The tone never shifts. The tone stays the same the whole time. Now, I train my students. There are a few words that if you see them, you should be clicking into your head, tone is shifting. You're shaking your head. Do you know what those words are?
No.
Say again. But. Right? Right. You know, I love the way you've done your hair, but I hate blondes. Right? I really appreciate your asking me to do this, PD, but I don't have the time. Right? But can just flip the tone, can it? Do we see a but, so to speak? But I make them circle that word. I say, if you have a pen, that pen better be out of ink. If you have a pencil, better run out of lead. That's an important word. Circle it. If we've got that but, then we know that there's the potential of a tone shift. Well, is there anything you see here that strikes you as something other than childlike? Terrified. What is a single word an example of in terms of literary devices? What do we call word choices that we've got? Diction, right? Terrified is definitely a diction choice. We've got words like trembling later on. We've got words like shoot. We have words like burst. Cornered, of course. So we've got all these different words that are diction choices. Is diction a literary device? But why are the diction choices there? Yes, to create and shift tone. Now, I'm going to give you a little secret that I normally do with the kids at the end, but I'm going to tell you now just because you've trusted me so far and I don't want to lose that trust. Why am I having them write all these whys? Because when we are done, yes, they will forget, but let's have a little faith and say maybe they wouldn't forget. Why would I have them write all this out? Because you are outlining an argumentative paper. Right? I mean, look, do we have a literary device? Do we have an example? Do we have explanation? Now they just have to put that into a paragraph, right? I mean, that's the BS English people do anyway, right? They take something really short and they just elaborate on it so they have a job and make money. But that's what we've done. Now, when we have an entire paper full of these, and then I say, now look, you don't have to write a 10-page paper on this, but give me 7 paragraphs. But what do I write on? No, that's what we just spent 2 days doing. Look what you have to write on. Does your paper look like this? No. Do you understand what we're talking about here? Yes. And wait till you see the papers that come across your desk. It just starts to change. They just start to speak our language. Either we changed them from aliens to humans, or they were humans and now we're changing them to aliens. Okay? Tone shift. Kids can write entire... Think about this. Any of you have students write a 5-paragraph essay? What if you establish the tone in your the initial tone in your first body paragraph? You talk about where and how the tone shifts. What the third body paragraph is what the new tone is, and then your concluding is why that tone shift exists. Now, by the end of the year, my kids aren't getting away with that. They've got to deal with tone all in one paragraph. But doesn't that paper start to write itself? Even for a student that I hate writing. I hate writing because I don't know what to write about. Right? Okay. Other things you notice. What do you think of the actual poem? What do you think of the actual poem? What's going on? Why is the tone shifting? What's it shifting from and to? It's shifting from childish to what? And when students are like, I don't know, I lost my tone sheet. Well, then go pick a word out of the poem. Poets give us hints. It goes from childish to what? Say again. To haunting. Right? From childish to haunting. Right? From childish to terrified. Right? Okay. We catch him in the angle of two stone fences. Now, this is where I would go with imagery. Right? Because what's the important image and detail? What's the important detail and image in the angle of two stone fences? What, you said what?
Trap.
It's a trap, but why is it a trap? What detail makes it a trap? It is a corner, but look, here's a fence. Say again? Yeah, we don't have a wood fence here. We have a stone fence, right? Now, once you're on day 2, and the kids start to talk about things like, well, it's almost like they were forced to make a choice because the fate of the fence being a stone fence forces them to trap the rabbit. Now, when you get them to start saying that, right? But there's no way they're getting there if you don't close read. All they're remembering upon a first read are the characters, 2 kids, and the plot. They shot a rabbit, they felt bad about it. But now you can talk about things like fate. You can talk about things like predestination. Right? That's a big deal. The kids get really into talking about that, but you're not getting there if you hand this poem to them and say, give me a paragraph on the predestination in this. There's no way. Right? So here we have details and images that I would say maybe create tension, maybe that force character choices. I don't know. He was sitting up, front paws together, supplicating, trembling, while we were deciding whether to shoot him or spare him. Notice anything about that part of the poem?
Yeah, he's in a state of submissiveness.
Say again?
He's in a state of submissiveness.
Okay, good. Now you're starting to deal not just with who the characters are, but how these characters are interacting. So you're dealing with characterization. Is characterization a literary device? Of course it's a tool that writers use to create literature, right? Characterization. But why is this characterization used to show his submissiveness? Now look, some kids would say to show Cottontail's submissiveness. And I would go with that. But could you take it to the next step? What is the point of showing the submissive rabbit?
It shows that they have power.
Good. It establishes power, right? Don't do this. We don't have time. But go to your universal idea sheet. Is power a universal idea? It is, right? Establishes power. And so for me, when I say, okay, we're done talking about the poem, what universal ideas do you see? When they don't say anything, I say, I actually see some that we've already written in our notes. Right? What else do you notice about this part of the poem? And let me help you out a little bit. What do you notice about, like, this part of the poem?
The lines get shorter.
Yeah, the lines do get shorter until this long one, right? What's that an example of in poetry? This is one that I don't spend a lot of time with, but we're dealing with form, right? Form. Not structure. Not structure, not the way the poem is structured in terms of chronology, in terms of time sequence, but just in terms of what it looks like. Say again? Well, syntax is sentence structure. I always think of Yoda, right? But this is actually just form, the way it looks. Now, is it go ahead. Ooh. Now, I usually have to feed that to them at the end. Your name is? Cecilia. You said genius? Cecilia. I'm sorry. Cecilia says, is the point of this to suggest the barrel of a rifle? Right? Now, my kids don't go there that quickly. Someone might. But if your kid can't go there initially, why else would this be the longest line in the poem? And say again? Okay, but I don't care about a decision. Why, if it's a decision, then why make the line so long? Keep going, you're on the right track. Say again? Time stops, and this decision, is it a small decision or is it a big decision? You've got a big decision to make here, right? You see that? So now we can say this form helps to what? Helps to blank the decision the kids must make. What word did you use?
Representative.
Helps to represent. Perfect. This helps to represent the decision the kids must make. It's kind of hard because when I think about teaching, I think about blowing kids' minds. Like the rifle blows their minds at the end. But when a kid blows the minds, at first my balloon loses a little bit of air because I was like, stole my line. However, when you've got kids, that is critical thinking, right? That is a huge moment for that student, right? Huge. You know who else it's a huge moment for? The student, Medelis Zayas, that sits right here and has not said a word the whole year, but in the first 15 seconds saw that was a rifle. Someone else confirms it, and in this quiet child's head, they confirm for themselves. It just becomes an extremely valuable moment for that student in the room. Last part of the poem. I shot first but missed, thank God. 3 lines. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 7 words. Notice any literary devices. This is a more conceptual one. This is a big one in my room. I'm going to spoon feed this one to you because it's... Well, there can be an allusion made to God. And then you've got the supplicating, the praying above, but to whom is the cottontail supplicating? Not to God, but to the children. I was about to say students. It's been a long day. To the children. So they almost take on what role? The God role. Oh, the kids really want to talk about that. But let me draw your attention somewhere else, just because I find that this literary device can separate... Say again? What do you mean by that? I shot first. We've kind of dealt with that in the speaker, but you can also remind students that you've got a first-person narrator or speaker here, right? Why do we shoot at things? Why do we shoot at something? To hit it.
Well, I think you try to miss, right?
Well, what is it when the point of something is to hit, but this person's doing the opposite? We've got an example of irony here. A major example of irony. I define irony in my room as the opposite of what is intended. A gun, when shot, is intended to hit something, but this kid shoots hoping he won't hit, right? You've got it, one of these. Please, no, please don't make me confront my loss of innocence this early in my life just because we accidentally got a cottontail.
Which generates the question, why shoot?
Huh?
Which generates the question, why does it shoot?
Good. And now you're starting to talk about theme, right? Now you're starting to talk about things like maturation. Now you're starting to talk about things like impulse, right? Human nature. Why the irony here? Why? What does it help us to better understand? author's position or speaker's position? Okay, speaker's position provides further information about the position, the perspective. Good. Then my friend fired and killed him. That's what you're supposed to do. And burst into tears. What is that an example of? We have double irony. We have irony back to back, just in case you missed it the first time.
Well, it's interesting because
Go ahead.
they're sad. They were intentionally going out to shoot woodchucks. And that's the point. But then it's a rabbit that comes out.
You got it.
More of, I guess, an innocent, a different.
You got it. And what we come to as readers in my room is, well, why are they out shooting woodchucks in a farmer's field? We eventually come to the thought that they've probably been hired. Couple of bored kids. Maybe that's where you got boring from, because you thought at first they were bored, right? You got a couple of bored kids that will shoot woodchucks a penny apiece. If you allow me, I'll get all these woodchucks off your field. How many woodchucks were around that day? None. No woodchucks. But we encountered a cottontail, right? And then it becomes this conflict of, well, I've been trained to kill, man's nature to destroy, but I don't think I'm supposed to destroy this thing, right? Conflict in self, right? Then my friend fired and killed him and burst into tears. I did too. A little cottontail, a haunter. Now, one of the literary devices we haven't talked a lot about is one that I think you can always talk about so much in writing and in class, but we just overlook so often. And that's repetition, right? Where do we see the word cottontail beside the second to last line? We see it in the 8th line. Anywhere else? That's extremely, and the title, right? We've got that word 3 times. Why? Why repetition of cottontail? Important in what way?
There's so much remorse and guilt.
Okay. Good. It helps to convey the guilt. It helps to convey the memory and how the memory has continued for 50 years. Good. What about this very last line? I always tell students, God, last lines are so important. A haunter.
What haunts his memories?
Okay, good. Haunts his memories. Anything else about that word, haunter?
Literary devices.
I'm just talking word.
Ghostly.
Good.
After death.
Good.
The usually negative connotation.
Okay.
It's dark.
Does that haunter word look like anything? It does look like hunter, doesn't it? And now we get into, oh. And what is that an example of? I'll give you a hint. Who was doing the hunting? The boys. But who is doing the hunting? The opposite of what is intended. You've got another irony here. I would say if you're looking for juxtaposition somewhere in here, it would be the juxtaposition between the 2 boys and the little cottontail rabbit, right? There's that juxtaposition almost of images or characterization. And some people will say, no, the juxtaposition is in the characterization because the little cottontail rabbit is an adult and knows to be scared. The big kids are young and don't know the magnitude of the situation they're in, right? We've got an irony here where the hunters, for a few days, have now become the hunted for 50 years, right? Now, wasn't even going to do this. Let me just pull out my cottontail from this is August 30th, right? Very similar, right? A lot of the same concepts. Is it always going to be the exact same? Are there things you're definitely going to want to hit on? What would you suggest is a major player in this poem in terms of literary devices? I'm going to hit irony early in the year with this one. Because I find that when students start to pick up on irony and ironic tendencies in writing, it just adds so much texture to the reading and the learning. See that? So I'm going to do irony. I'm definitely going to do alliteration here because I think it's extremely important to the poem. Now, here's the job of the teacher. You got to be very intentional with the poems you pick. And then when you read them, look, this is why it's so hard to chart data for English and so easy to chart it for math. Everything is involved in all of these poems. We could go back and find 15 other literary devices. And when I spend 2 days, sometimes I will. But you want to find those few that you can connect back, right? Don't you all see 3 weeks later that this is ironic? Ironic, what do you mean? Well, don't you remember in Cottontail, we saw these different ironies, the opposite of what is intended. Can you make that connection now? And they'll start to figure out what their brain was doing a couple weeks ago and then make it happen again. Or at least we cross our fingers and hope they do. This is not easy, right? And the equation does not always balance in this room, right? I mean, you have to deal with literature and you have to anticipate what are they going to come up with? What are they not going to come up with that I have to show them, right? And I also pick things like Cottontail. You can go on Cottontail. There's no Spark Notes Cottontail. There's no cheat sheet Cottontail. There's just not a lot of those. So I have to do it myself. I have to figure it out. I've become a much better reader of literature since I've started doing this close reading because it forces me to do it. I'll just tell you right now, and this is because I'm crazy, but like I read My Antonia, it's a novel by Willa Cather. I don't make them close read and annotate the entire book, but you better believe that I do the entire book. And it takes me hours. I taught this for the first time last year, but now I've got this document. So now when I teach it this year, it's good to go. I'm a new teacher. I've only been doing this a few years. But now I did all that work now, and I feel like I really understand this. I feel like if the kids have questions for me, I've really got it. But it definitely takes time. I mean, it definitely takes time. And
you do it once, like you said, you have that.
yeah, like when Jenny said, "Can you do a PD?" I said, "Sure," and I was like, "I'm going to do Cottontail. I've got that one in the back of my head. I've got that one whenever I want it." I think teachers really get into this poem, and kids really do too.